Good evening, my friends, and welcome back aboard. If you've somehow stumbled here half awake, phone in hand, eyes already heavy, that's perfect. You're exactly where you need to be. Tonight's story isn't about chasing treasure or fighting sea monsters. It's about something far more heroic, trying to get a good night's sleep while the ocean itself tries to kill you. Now, before we begin, make sure your blanket isn't twisted around your legs. Take a slow, deep breath through your nose, and maybe loosen your jaw a little. You've earned this moment of stillness. And if you're one of those brave souls who listens to sleep stories while pretending you'll just watch for 5 minutes, I've got bad news for you. You won't make it to the end. You'll be snoring long before the first cannon fires. Alright, let's set sail together. Tonight, we begin not on land, not by a fire, not wrapped in wool or straw, but standing with you on the deck of a wooden pirate ship as winter tightens its grip around the medieval sea. The planks beneath your boots are stiff with cold, the salt spray freezes almost the instant it touches your skin, and the wind, sharp, invisible, merciless, cuts straight through your clothes as if they were paper. Somewhere above you, canvas snaps in the wind, the mast complains in a low wooden groan that never quite stops, and beneath it all you hear the heartbeat of the ship itself, creaking, straining, whispering against the waves. This is where your night will happen. This is where you still try to sleep, and the truth, whispered in every sailor's bones, is simple. Winter at sea doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care about bravery, about reputation, or about gold hidden in the hold. It only cares about heat and how fast your body loses it. So, before you get too comfortable, imagine this. No mattress, no pillow, no warm fire waiting for you. Only wet planks, frozen ropes, and the slow breathing of exhausted men trying to pretend the cold can't reach them. The pirates of the late medieval world lived in motion. They slept when the sea allowed it, ate when supplies permitted it, and prayed silently that the wind would stay mild just long enough to rest without freezing. Most ships weren't built for humans at all. They were captured traders or fishing vessels designed for cargo, not comfort, built to move goods, not to cradle the weary. Every inch of the ship was claimed by rope, barrel, sail, or weapon, leaving only narrow spaces for bodies to fold into. As darkness falls, you climb below deck, shoulders hunched, and the first thing that greets you isn't warmth, it's smell. Tar, damp wood, sweat, rope, sea, all of it blending into one thick, unmistakable perfume of endurance. It's unpleasant, yes, but it means the wind can't reach you, and that small mercy counts for everything tonight. There's no bedtime here, no candlelight routine. Sleep is taken the way pirates took everything, whenever they could, from whoever had it last. Some curled up on the planks beside barrels, others hung from rough canvas hammocks tied between beams. Hammocks kept you off the cold floor, away from rats and moisture, but they swayed endlessly, and in winter that meant movement, and movement meant cold. The deck, on the other hand, was solid, hard, unforgiving, but still. It held the day's stored heat, tiny and fading, but enough to matter. And so you lie down without undressing, because every stitch of wool and leather is another shield between you and the night. You tuck your knees in, fold your arms close, and breathe in the rhythm of the sea, that low, endless hum that becomes the closest thing to a lullaby you'll ever get out here. Sleep doesn't come all at once. It arrives like the tide, in pieces. A few minutes of drifting, a shiver that wakes you, the sound of boots above, another body shifting near your side, then drifting again, softer, slower, until you forget where the deck ends and the darkness begins. And that, my friend, is where we'll begin our night together. Not as heroes, not as captains, but as human beings simply trying to stay warm enough to dream. You wake without truly waking. Your eyes remain closed, but your body already knows where it is. Somewhere between wood and air, between motion and stillness. Around you, the ship breathes, slow and heavy, the sound of water against the hull, a rhythm that might be called peace if it weren't so cold. Not everyone sleeps the same way aboard this ship. Some hang in hammocks, rough canvas tied between beams, swaying softly with the movement of the sea. Others lie directly on the deck, pressed against the planks like letters sealed into an oak envelope. Both believe their choice is wiser. Both are wrong. The hammocks, they say, were a gift from the Caribbean, a clever idea borrowed from the indigenous sailors who slept suspended between trees. The design made sense, easy to store, easy to move, and far from the rats that prowled the lower decks. During the warmer months, it was almost pleasant to swing above the ship's heartbeat, rocking gently like a child in a cradle. But in winter the air became the enemy. Every sway pushed new cold around the body, fresh drafts creeping underneath the canvas like invisible fingers. The wind moved through the seams and stole heat with every breath. Sailors learned to wrap themselves in layers, to knot their coats around their chests, to sleep half-curled and gripping the fabric as if the cold itself were a thief trying to pull them down. And then there were those who chose the planks. Hard, uneven, splintered. The deck was no bed, but it was honest. It didn't move, it didn't rock, and most importantly, it held what little warmth the day had given. Wood absorbs heat even from footsteps, and at night it released it back in a slow, patient way, barely enough to notice, but enough to matter, lying flat against the planks, close to barrels or coils of rope. The body could steal a few degrees of comfort. The cost was bruises, stiffness, and the dull ache that came with dawn. There is no best choice at sea, only what keeps you alive a little longer. Somewhere nearby, someone turns over in their hammock, and the sound is like a sigh of fabric. Another sailor coughs, that deep, wet sound that carries exhaustion more than illness. You pull your coat tighter, shift your weight, and listen to the wood breathe beneath you. It creaks softly, flexing with the swell, whispering secrets in a language only the tired can understand. Historians still debate which way was better, hammocks or decks, but the truth depends on the night. Hammocks spared you from damp wood but left you open to the air. Decks stole your bones but sheltered your lungs. And in a brutal medieval winter, the wrong choice could be the difference between waking stiff and not waking at all. Pirates learned to adapt. Some tied their hammocks lower to the ground, trapping warm air beneath. Others layered spare sailcloth over their sleeping spot, like makeshift insulation. A few wrapped ropes around their feet to keep them from sliding when the ship rolled sharply. Comfort wasn't the goal, survival was. You shift again, not fully awake, but aware enough to feel the cold pressing against your cheek, the faint smell of tar and old salt, and the low rhythmic breathing of the man beside you. You don't know his name, you might not even remember his voice, but tonight you share warmth, and that's enough. The air grows thicker the longer you lie there. Heat from bodies and breath creates a humid pocket beneath the deck, unpleasant but precious. You can smell it. Wool, sweat, smoke, sea. The air feels used, lived in, but it's warm, and that makes it holy. Above you, the ocean moans softly against the wood. You feel its movement, not as sound but as vibration, passing through the planks into your bones. The ship moves, and with it, your heartbeat falls into rhythm, slow and steady. You are not comfortable, but you are enduring. And that in this world means you are winning. You do not dream in full pictures tonight. Only fragments, flashes of sunlight that no longer exist. The shape of a coastline you once raided. The face of someone you left behind. They drift across your mind like the flicker of lantern light through a crack in the boards. And through it all, one thought moves with you. That warmth, when found, is never truly yours at sea. It is borrowed, from wood, from bodies, from luck, and it must always be repaid by morning. Somewhere in the dark belly of the ship, warmth begins to move again. Not much, just a faint pulse of heat drifting through the stale air like a secret. You don't see it at first, but you feel it. The cold no longer bites quite so sharply, and your fingers, half numb, begin to remember that they belong to you. The warmth comes from a brazier, a shallow iron pan packed with glowing coals, the closest thing to a hearth a pirate ship could safely allow. It's not bright and it's not loud. The light doesn't flicker the way fire should. It glows, softly, carefully, watched always by one tired man whose job is simply to keep it alive without letting it escape. Fire aboard a wooden ship is a contradiction you can feel in your bones. It is both salvation and threat, warmth and death at the same time. A single spark could end everything. Yet without that glow, winter could end you first. Every sailor, pirate or not, knew that balance. They carried it like a superstition. Too much heat meant danger. Too little meant frostbite. And so the night became a quiet negotiation between the two. The air around the brazier is different. You can taste it, a dry metallic warmth, faintly bitter, mixed with the thicker smells of tar, rope and salt. It seeps slowly outward, reaching the sleepers closest first. Those who are near it stretch their hands just close enough to feel the edge of the heat, then pull them back again before the air burns. Those further away feel nothing but the memory of warmth, carried through breath and bodies. No one complains. They all know the rule, everyone gets a turn eventually. But no one hoards it. The heat moves through the night like a ration of light, small, shared, never enough. You imagine the man tending the coals now, eyes half closed, trying not to fall asleep. The glow paints his face red and gold, makes the sweat on his forehead shine like melted brass. The ship rocks gently, and the coals shift with a faint hiss, each one a tiny sun caught between survival and disaster. Fire changes the way a ship sounds. Without it, the cold makes wood creak sharply. The planks contract and complain. With heat, the noise softens. The ship seems to sigh instead of groan. It's as if the vessel itself feels the warmth, loosening its joints, easing its weight. You notice the difference now. The rhythm of the hull against the sea is slower, deeper, more patient. The air feels alive again. Some historians argue that pirates rarely risked open fire below deck, that it was madness. But the evidence left behind tells a quieter truth. Charred pans, soot-stained beams, blackened patches along the keel, all whispers that men did what they had to do, even when the rules said they shouldn't. The fire was a gamble, yes, but so was everything at sea. You shift slightly toward the heat without thinking. The air touches your face, faint but real, and the effect is immediate. Muscles soften, your jaw loosens, your breathing deepens. For the first time all night, your body begins to release the tension it has been storing since sunset. Around you, the other sleepers move too. Not much, just small adjustments. Someone rolls closer to another's side. Someone murmurs a dream into the dark. The ship itself seems to cradle everyone more gently now, as if soothed by its own fragile warmth. There's an old saying among sailors that a ship in winter carries two hearts, one made of wood and one made of fire. If either one goes out, the other follows. You look toward the faint glow in the distance, eyes half open, not sure whether you're awake or dreaming. The fire isn't bright enough to see faces, only outlines, bent shoulders, tucked knees, a sea of breathing bodies lit by ember light. Each one a story, each one holding on to warmth that could vanish with a careless spark. For a few minutes the cold forgets about you. The night feels less like punishment, more like pause. You close your eyes again, the smell of smoke drifting around you like a blanket. The sound of the coals shifts softly, a small sigh, a faint crack, and the rhythm of the ship carries you deeper into rest. You are sleeping beside danger now, but it is a kind of danger that feels merciful. And for pirates in the heart of winter, mercy was all they ever asked for. Sleep doesn't set end so much as it breaks. Not sharply, not like a sudden alarm, but like a wooden beam beginning to groan under new weight. The change comes first as vibration, the ship's rhythm shifting ever so slightly beneath you, the roll deepening, the sounds thickening. Then the wind changes tone. It begins to howl, not the playful wind that toys with sails, but the one that pushes, that tests, that speaks in long, low voices of warning. You hear it move across the deck, whistling through rigging and rope, pressing hard against every inch of the hull, until even your bones feel the pressure. The warmth that lulled you moments ago begins to retreat. pulled away by drafts, forcing themselves through cracks you hadn't noticed before. Your body reacts without permission, curling tighter, drawing knees in, tucking your chin. Around you, other bodies do the same. There's a chorus of fabric shifting, boots scraping, breath catching. The sea outside has changed its shape. It no longer sighs against the wood, it throws itself at it. The sound is enormous, long rolling surges that crash, pause, and crash again. Each one slightly closer, slightly harder. Somewhere above, a voice shouts, muffled and brief. Then boots thunder overhead, the quick, deliberate rhythm of sailors fighting wind with rope and command. You do not move. You cannot help them, and they will not ask. Your job now is to stay still, to stay warm, and to keep your breath steady. Storms in winter were feared by every sailor, but they carried a unique cruelty for pirates, whose ships were smaller, lighter, and less prepared for endurance than those of the navy. Frozen ropes snapped like glass. Canvas stiffened until it tore. The cold made hands slow and minds slower. Even the bravest men became clumsy when their fingers could no longer feel. The ship lurches suddenly, lifting you from the deck for half a heartbeat before dropping you again, gently but decisively. You grip a rope beside you and let the movement pass through you, instead of against you. You learn to yield. Resistance at sea breaks things, surrender saves them. Someone nearby swears softly under their breath. Not fear, just acknowledgement. Another mutters a prayer, quiet and short, the kind spoken by habit rather than belief. The fire is gone now. The brazier has been smothered. Storm and flame are sworn enemies. The air feels colder, sharper, but cleaner. You can taste the salt even here, deep below deck, brought in by the storm's breath. It stings your throat but clears your mind. Historians describe nights like this in quiet understatement. Conditions deteriorated, the logs say, or the crew took to stations. What they do not say is what it felt like. The vibration of the ship like a heartbeat inside your chest. The sound of the wind like a living thing. And the slow realization that you are inside a creature made of wood and fear and salt. And it is alive because you are. You close your eyes, not to sleep, but to listen better. The ship moans again, longer this time, bending instead of breaking. You can hear water moving inside the walls, the strange sloshing of the bilge below, and for a moment it feels as if the ocean itself is breathing through the boards. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the storm's rhythm evens out. Still violent, but predictable now. The chaos finds its pattern, and that pattern becomes your lullaby. You breathe with it. Inhale as the ship lifts, exhale as it drops. The human body adapts faster than reason does. Sleep comes back to you in fragments, light, fragile, but real. You are still surrounded by noise and motion, but somehow it becomes comforting again. The cold loses its sharp edge. It presses rather than bites. Someone near you sighs in relief. Another shifts slightly closer. Warmth begins to rebuild itself from within the group. You begin to understand the strange peace that sailors speak of after storms. The moment when chaos stops feeling like danger and starts feeling like proof that the ship still lives. The wind screams above you, but inside the wooden shell of the world, a strange kind of silence settles, the silence of men who have surrendered to forces too large to fight, who close their eyes and rest not because they are safe, but because there is nothing left to do but trust the ship to carry them. You fall asleep like that, not in comfort, not in safety, but in the rhythm of survival. And when the morning finally comes and the sea has spent its rage, the ship will still be standing, and so will you. It begins with a sound, not a crack or a crash, just a shift, a deeper note in the wooden voice of the ship, a subtle warning that the sea outside is changing its mood. The gentle rocking that once felt like a lullaby now grows heavier, more deliberate. You can feel it even before you hear it. Then the wind arrives. It doesn't knock. It forces its way in, sweeping across the deck, dragging spray and sleet in its teeth. The ropes above strain and groan. The mast complains in a deep, painful tone. and the sails beat like panicked wings trying to escape the storm. Each sound layers on top of the next until the air itself feels crowded with noise, the kind of noise that fills your ribs and makes you breathe slower without realizing it. The warmth that lingered from the brazier fades quickly, pulled away by icy drafts sneaking through the cracks. You pull your coat tighter, draw your arms close, and feel the muscles in your shoulders stiffen against the cold. Around you, the others are stirring too. A shiver here, a cough there, the small restless sounds of men who know something bigger than themselves is moving outside. Storms at sea don't announce themselves politely. They happen like mood swings, sudden, absolute, terrifying in their indifference. In winter they are worse, because everything that could save you becomes your enemy. The ropes freeze, sails stiffen, water turns to needles that cut the face. Even your own hands become useless, slow and clumsy, untrustworthy. The ship tilts sharply, a long, slow lean that lifts your stomach into your throat before settling again. A few drops of cold water find their way down through the boards, falling in rhythmic taps on the wood beside you. Each one lands like a reminder. The sea is always here, even when you can't see it. Above deck there's shouting, not panic, but order shouted through the wind. Footsteps run, ropes thud, pulleys scream. You picture them there in the darkness, silhouettes fighting the air, trying to hold the world together with nothing but hands and hope. You stay where you are. That's your duty now, to stay still, to stay alive, to stay warm. The fire is long gone. No one would risk a single ember now. In a storm, light means death. Heat means danger. The air down here is bitter and cold, but clean. You can smell the ocean even through the wood. Salt, wet rope, the faint sweetness of tar warming under strain. The hull groans louder, bending under the weight of the waves but not breaking. You can feel every movement in your spine, the lift, the drop, the soft slide as the ship adjusts. It's like being inside a living creature, one that is suffering but determined to survive. The noise becomes rhythm. The chaos turns to pulse. Somewhere beside you, someone whispers a curse. Another answers with a prayer. The two sounds blend until they're indistinguishable. Fear and faith always sound the same at sea. The storm grows darker, but strangely, that darkness brings calm. There's nothing left to fight, no choice left to make. You surrender to motion. The fear becomes background. Your breathing finds the ship's rhythm again. In, out, rise, fall. You start to drift, half asleep, rocked not by comfort but by exhaustion. The noise outside is immense, yet it begins to soothe you the way thunder sometimes soothes a child. It means the world is still moving, still alive. The ship tilts once more, then steadies. The worst has passed. You can feel it, not because it's quiet, but because the panic has vanished from the sound. Above, men still move, but their footsteps have slowed. The wind is still strong, but its voice has lost its rage. Inside the hold, surrounded by the smell of smoke, wet wool, and old salt, you feel the storm pull away from you. Not gone, just distant now, like a bad dream drifting toward morning. You close your eyes again. The sea still growls, but it no longer threatens. It only reminds. And as the ship rocks beneath you, heavy but alive, you realize that survival at sea isn't about strength or courage. It's about surrender. The quiet kind, the kind that lets you sleep even while the world roars around you. You breathe out slowly, letting the cold settle, and in that breath, the storm finally gives you permission to rest. Morning does not arrive with color, only with sound. The sea no longer roars. It breathes. The wind that tore through the rigging now moves softly, brushing past torn sails with a gentleness that feels almost apologetic, as if ashamed of what it did in the dark. You open your eyes slowly, unsure whether you have slept for minutes or hours. The world around you is dim, tinted in shades of grey-blue, the light of dawn filtering through the cracks in the deck above like pale smoke. The air is still cold but not cruel. The storm has taken its anger and gone elsewhere. The ship is alive, but tired, Every board creaks softly in recovery, as if sighing in relief after a night spent clenched and trembling. Drops of water slide from beam to beam, falling into shallow puddles below. Each splash is soft and final, the last voice of the storm fading into silence. You sit up slowly, your body heavy, your clothes stiff with salt and cold. The air smells of wet wood and iron, but beneath it, faintly, almost tenderly, there is the scent of smoke, the ghost of the fire that warmed you before the wind came. Around you, others begin to stir, moving like people who have aged years in a single night. No one speaks yet. The quiet feels sacred, like the ship itself has requested silence. The light grows. You see faces now, pale, drawn, but alive. Someone smiles, a small, weary thing that vanishes as quickly as it appeared. Someone else stretches their hands before them, watching steam rise faintly from damp sleeves. The sound of joints cracking replaces the sound of thunder. Historians often write about battles and gold when they talk about pirates. But this quiet, grey aftermath was their true daily victory. To wake up, to find the ship still standing, to breathe cold air and know that the night failed to take you, that was the treasure. Above deck, a single voice calls out, not urgent, not afraid. It's the morning watch, the first sign that order has returned. Footsteps follow, slow and deliberate, the wood creaking beneath boots that test the world as if unsure it's real again. The sound is comforting, familiar. You climb the ladder, one rung at a time, hands rough against the frozen iron. The air that greets you is sharp and clean, like the first breath after fever. The sky is heavy with cloud, but no longer threatening. The horizon glows faintly where the sun is trying to push through. The sea rolls slow and swollen, grey as pewter, bruised but calm. Everything glistens. Ropes shimmer with frost. Sails hang torn but shining wet in the early light. Water runs down the deck in narrow streams that catch the dull reflection of dawn. The ship looks battered, yes, but also baptized, as though the storm has stripped it bare and left it renewed. You see your crewmates emerge behind you, blinking into the cold light, faces hollow but content. One of them laughs, just once, quietly. The kind of laugh that means we're still here. Someone else claps him on the shoulder without words. In that small gesture lies the truth of life at sea. No one conquers the ocean. You simply make peace with it, night after night, until it decides to spare you again. You take in a deep breath, the kind that fills your chest and stings the lungs, and for the first time in hours, the air feels clean. Your heartbeat, once lost in the roar, returns to you. The wind no longer steals it. Below, someone lights the brazier again. The faint glow rises through the cracks, carrying with it the smell of coal and relief. You watch the smoke drift upward into the new morning, curling and twisting, dissolving into pale light. The storm is gone, the sea is calm, and the pirates, tired, stiff, salt-stained, stand in quiet communion with the only world they truly belong to. For now there will be warmth and food, and maybe laughter. And when night comes again, and the cold returns, they will do what they have always done, pull their coats tight, find a place against the wood, and let the ocean sing them back to sleep. Morning came without ceremony, quietly, almost shy, like something fragile returning after exile. And when you first opened your eyes, it was not light that greeted you, but stillness, a strange, weightless silence that felt heavier than the storm itself, because the sea, that wild, roaring creature that had ruled the night, was suddenly calm again, exhausted, its rage spent somewhere beyond the horizon, leaving behind only a slow, deliberate rhythm, the gentle rise and fall of the water against the wood, a rhythm so soft that it seemed to hum beneath your skin. The air below deck was thick and cold, carrying the stale scent of wet wool, burnt tar, salt and breath. Yet it felt strangely alive now, no longer suffocating, but full of the quiet knowledge that you had survived, that the ship had endured, and that the night's fury had passed without taking anyone with it. At least not this time. You sat up slowly, your body heavy and aching, every muscle stiff from bracing against the ship's movement for hours, your clothes crusted with salt and half frozen against your skin, the damp fabric clinging to you like memory. And as you looked around, you saw other shapes beginning to stir, men with faces pale and hollow, eyes blinking against the dim grey light that filtered down through cracks in the deck, a soft haze of moisture catching in the air like dust suspended in a church nave after candles have burned all night. No one spoke for a long while, because words would have felt intrusive, unnecessary, almost disrespectful in that fragile silence after chaos. And so they moved quietly, testing limbs, stretching arms, rubbing hands together for warmth, each gesture small but sacred, each one proof of life reclaimed. When you finally climbed up the ladder to the deck, the world that met you was pale and shivering and beautiful in its emptiness. The horizon washed in pewter grey, the sun hidden behind a veil of high cloud, the air so sharp it stung your lungs, but clean in a way only the aftermath of violence can be. The ship looked battered, its ropes stiff with frost, its sails hanging in torn silence, every surface slick with moisture that caught the dull light and turned it to silver. The sea moved lazily now, vast and indifferent, long waves rolling beneath the hull with the weight of something that has seen everything, and still feels nothing. And for the first time since nightfall, you could hear the smaller sounds again, the tapping of water dripping from the mast, the quiet shuffle of boots on the wet deck, the sigh of someone lighting a new fire below, the soft creak of timbers expanding as the wood began to warm. You leaned on the railing and drew a long breath, tasting the salt that clung to the air, and it felt like swallowing the memory of fear itself, cold and metallic but strangely pure, as if the storm had cleansed not just the ship but everything inside you that was restless or angry or afraid. A few men stood beside you, silent, staring at the horizon, as if trying to confirm that the world was still there, and one of them smiled faintly, a small tired smile that lasted only a heartbeat before vanishing into the mist. And it was enough, a gesture so quiet it didn't need language, an acknowledgement that being alive in this place on this morning was a victory no treasure could equal. Above, gulls began to appear again, their cries distant and thin, their wings bright against the grey sky, and for the first time in hours, the ocean didn't feel like an enemy. It was simply itself again, vast, breathing, immense, and eternal. The ship creaked under your feet like a living creature stretching after pain, and somewhere below deck, the faint orange glow of a brazier flickered to life once more, smoke curling upward through the cracks, bringing with it the familiar scent of coal and relief. It was not warmth exactly, but the promise of it, and that was enough. And as the day slowly began to unfold across the cold grey water, you understood, perhaps more deeply than ever before, that a pirate's greatest treasure was not gold, or rum, or freedom. It was simply this: to wake up after a storm, to breathe again, to stand upon wood that had not splintered, and to feel the living sea, calm and immense, breathing beside you as if in truce. When the light of morning finally settled over the ship, pale and uncertain, it revealed a world that looked half drowned and half reborn, for everything that had survived the night now seemed to glisten with quiet exhaustion, the ropes stiff with frost, the sails drooping like tired lungs, the deck slick and shining, where seawater and melted ice ran together into narrow veins that reflected the cold, silvery sky above. The men moved slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile peace that lingered after the storm, speaking in low voices if they spoke at all, their faces drawn but calm, their gestures deliberate, as if each movement carried the weight of both gratitude and fatigue. The morning ritual aboard a pirate ship was never about ceremony, but about survival disguised as routine. The first sound to return was the strike of flint against steel, a sharp, defiant spark that cut through the hush like the clearing of a throat, followed by the faint hiss of tinder catching flame. Soon a small fire burned again in the iron brazier near the galley, and its thin smoke drifted lazily upward, curling through the damp air, and filling the ship with that comforting human scent of warmth. Smoke mixed with salt, with wet hemp, with the ghost of the night's fear evaporating into nothing. One by one, the crew brought their soaked clothes closer to the heat, stretching arms and sleeves above the coals, turning them slowly, as if tending something sacred. Steam rose from the fabric like spirit leaving flesh, soft and white, vanishing as soon as it appeared. No one spoke while they did it. There was no need. The act itself was language enough, a gesture of persistence, of quiet rebuilding. A few men rubbed their hands together briskly, watching the color return to their fingers, while others simply stood near the glow with eyes half closed, letting the warmth crawl up their faces in slow, patient waves. Food came next, though calling it food was generous. A mixture of dried peas, salted pork, hard bread, soaked in seawater, and reheated until it softened just enough to chew. Yet in the cold of morning, after a night that might have taken them, it tasted miraculous, each bite carrying the dull sweetness of life reclaimed. They ate standing, hunched and silent, staring out at the grey horizon, their breath visible in the air, drifting upward like offerings. Someone began to hum quietly. An old sea song, its melody barely there, rising and falling with the roll of the ship. And before long another joined, and then another, until the sound became a low, steady current beneath the morning, neither joyful nor mournful, but something between, a tune for those who have seen too much to sing loudly. The sea, still heavy and slow, answered in rhythm, its surface wrinkling softly in time with the melody, and for a moment it almost felt as if it was listening. The captain appeared last, his coat soaked, his hair clinging to his face, his boots leaving dark prints behind him as he walked across the deck. But his voice, when it came, was steady. He gave no speech, no blessing, only a few practical orders: check the lines, inspect the mast, patch the sail, and the crew obeyed without hesitation, moving as one organism, each man knowing his place, each gesture rehearsed by 1,000 mornings just like this. There was comfort in that repetition, in the way labor filled the emptiness left by fear. As the ship slowly came back to life, the smell of burning coal deepened, blending with the sea air, until it became impossible to tell where warmth ended and salt began. The brazier's glow flickered on faces still pale from the cold, painting them in shifting shades of amber and grey, and for a few brief minutes time itself seemed to stretch, slow and dissolve, into the rhythm of the ship's gentle rocking. By midday, the frost on the ropes had melted, the deck had dried, and the sun, pale, reluctant but present, began to show itself between the thinning clouds. It was not much, only a soft light diffused across the water, but to the men aboard it felt like a benediction. They squinted into it, blinking, smiling faintly, their eyes watering not from emotion but from the sheer brightness of being alive beneath it. And as they worked, drying their clothes, checking their weapons, counting their rations, they fell again into the quiet unity that only sailors understand, that shared unspoken faith that the ship will hold, that the sea will forgive, and that tonight, when darkness returns, they will find some small corner of wood and warmth to call home again, because in the end, that was all the morning ritual ever truly was, a silent agreement between men and ocean, between storm and survival, between the world that takes and the few who refuse to be taken. The days that followed were slow, colourless, and endless in their sameness, because winter at sea was not made of moments but of hours that blended together, until time itself seemed to forget how to move, and everything, the ship, the sky, the men, fell into the same rhythm of grey persistence. The cold was constant, not sharp enough to kill outright, but always present, crawling under coats and through seams, hiding in wet boots and in the cracks of old wood, whispering its way into bones until every movement became deliberate, careful, almost ceremonial. The pirates learned to live inside this chill, to measure their days not by sunlight or stars but by the degrees of discomfort that marked each hour. Morning was the worst, when clothes stiffened overnight and had to be pulled on like armor, each frozen sleeve a small punishment, each buckle a negotiation with numb fingers. Their breath hung in the air like smoke, their voices rasped with salt and cold, and even laughter, when it came, sounded brittle, breaking apart before it reached the deck. Yet in that cold monotony, a strange companionship took shape, something quieter and deeper than friendship, born not of choice but of endurance shared. Men who barely spoke on calm days now worked side by side without a word, passing tools, tightening ropes and mending sails in silence, because speech was unnecessary when everyone already knew what had to be done. They learned to find comfort in proximity, in another body's warmth near the brazier, in the shared breath of two men huddled beneath the same coarse blanket, in the sound of someone quietly humming through chattering teeth. When storms did not come, the sea settled into a slow, heavy roll that made sleep easier, but the days harder, because stillness left room for thought, and thought was a dangerous luxury at sea. Some men spoke of home, of firesides and taverns and women whose faces they could no longer remember clearly. Others preferred silence, choosing instead to occupy their hands with endless, meaningless tasks, polishing rust that would return by morning, braiding ropes that didn't need braiding, counting supplies that were already known by heart. Food was always the same: salted meat, hard bread, dried beans boiled in brine, until they became a thick grey paste that smelled faintly of despair but filled the stomach just enough to matter. Water tasted of the barrel, sour, heavy and cold, and sometimes a bit of rum was added, not for pleasure but for courage, a small flame swallowed against the ocean's endless chill. There were no mirrors on board, but if there had been, no man would have liked what he saw. Beards grew wild, skin cracked and flaked, eyes sank deeper into their sockets, and the lines of fatigue carved themselves into faces that seemed far older than the men who wore them. Yet no one complained, because vanity was as useless at sea as fear. What mattered was the ship's heart, the mast standing firm, the ropes holding fast, and the faint glow of the fire that still burned each night in its iron bowl like a heartbeat no storm could extinguish. Sometimes, in rare moments when the wind died completely and the sea lay flat as polished glass, a kind of peace would fall over the ship that felt almost holy. The men would stop their work and simply listen, to the creak of wood, to the slow exhale of the waves, to their own breathing blending into the world around them. In those moments the ocean felt less like an enemy, and more like a vast, ancient companion, cruel but honest, testing them not out of hatred but out of necessity, as though demanding to know each morning if they still deserved to live upon its surface. At night, the cold deepened and every man became an island unto himself. They slept in their clothes, boots still on, coats buttoned to the throat, hats pulled down over their eyes. Those lucky enough to have hammocks swayed in the darkness like cocoons. The rest curled against barrels or slept sitting upright against the walls, arms wrapped around themselves, faces turned toward the faint orange breath of the brazier. The ship creaked and whispered as it moved through the dark, and the sea answered in low murmurs, and somewhere between those sounds sleep would come, not restful, not kind, but sufficient. Days blurred into weeks, and winter became less of a season and more of a state of being, an atmosphere that wrapped itself around the ship like a second hull, invisible but absolute. And through it all the pirates endured, not because they were fearless, but because they had learned the quiet truth of survival, that the ocean does not reward the strong or the brave, only the stubborn. They endured because they had no other choice, because the sea, in its cold indifference, was both their prison and their home, because somewhere deep in their bones, beneath the frost and salt, they understood that life aboard a winter ship was not about comfort or conquest, but about the simple, stubborn act of waking up each morning and beginning again. As the days stretched onward, and the sea settled into its long grey season of cold, life aboard the ship began to follow a rhythm that was both simple and punishing, a slow repetition of movement, noise, and endurance that blurred the line between surviving and merely existing. Every surface of the vessel seemed permanently damp, the ropes slick with salt, the wood always sweating from condensation, the very air thick with the smell of brine and mildew, and no matter how carefully a man tried to keep his clothes dry, there was always a trace of wetness in the fabric, a clammy reminder that warmth was not a state but a fleeting privilege, granted only to those lucky enough to stand near the brazier at the right time. The cold crept into everything, even into thought. Fingers stiffened until the act of tying a knot became a quiet test of patience. Boots froze to the deck at night, and had to be broken loose in the morning, and faces grew pale and wind-burned, etched with fine red lines like maps of fatigue. The sea itself seemed slower, heavier, its colour drained of life, grey on grey, a horizon barely distinct from the sky, and the men learned not to look too long into it, for staring at emptiness for days could hollow the mind in ways no weapon ever could. Still, life went on because it had to. The pirates worked in short bursts, conserving strength like sailors do when food runs thin, their days marked by small rituals rather than grand adventures. They repaired torn canvas, scraped salt from the railings, mended ropes with numb fingers, and checked for leaks that the storm might have hidden. Every task had a rhythm. Every rhythm had a sound, the scrape of a blade against ice, the groan of wood under shifting weight, the slap of waves against the hull, and when the work was done, there was waiting, endless, silent waiting. Below deck, the ship was a world of shadow and breath, a narrow maze of bodies and rope and smoke. The hammocks hung close, swaying in unison like lungs inhaling and exhaling together, and the men slept in turns, always half aware of the others beside them. They told stories in whispers, sometimes lies about gold and fortune, sometimes memories of land that felt too far away to be real anymore. They laughed occasionally, not from joy but from the strange comfort of hearing human voices in a place where everything else sounded like the sea. Food became both anchor and torment. Hardtack biscuits that shattered like stone, salted meat, tough as rope, and water so stale it smelled faintly of wood and iron. Yet even this was treasure, and no one complained aloud. Hunger at sea was a quiet thing, a steady ache that never left, merely softened when shared among those who understood it. Sickness crept slowly among them. The cold made wounds heal badly. The damp turned coughs into infections, and the lack of fresh fruit rotted teeth and darkened gums. But pirates were proud men, and pride can survive where medicine cannot. They chewed rope ends soaked in rum, rubbed salt on sores, wrapped cloth around their chests to hold in the warmth that no longer existed. They told themselves the cold was an enemy to be outlasted, not defeated, and somehow in their stubbornness they were right. At dusk, when the light faded into the same colour as the water, the crew would gather near the brazier again, drawn like moths to the thin circle of orange heat that pushed against the blue of the air. They spoke softly, traded rations, shared bits of tobacco, and watched the coals pulse in rhythm with the ship's breathing. There was something sacred in that small fire, not just warmth, but proof that life could still exist in defiance of the endless cold. Sometimes one of them would hum a tune, just loud enough to rise above the creak of the wood, and the sound would wander through the ship like a ghost, part lullaby, part memory, part prayer. The others would listen without comment, their eyes fixed on nothing, their thoughts scattered across distant shores they might never see again. And yet, for all its hardship, there was a strange beauty in that frozen life, the kind that exists only in endurance, in the quiet strength of men who learn to find comfort, not in luxury but in persistence. Because aboard a winter ship, comfort was not warmth, and safety was not the absence of danger. Comfort was a shared silence. Safety was the simple act of waking up again. When night came, they went to their hammocks or to the planks beneath, wrapping themselves in the same damp clothes they had worn all day, curling against the cold with the instinct of animals and the faith of sailors, and as the ship rocked beneath the pale light of an indifferent moon, they slept not because it was peaceful, but because it was necessary. And above them the ocean went on breathing, vast and patient and eternal, carrying their fragile warmth across the frozen world, reminding them with every slow wave that survival was not victory, but it was enough. As winter deepened and the ship pressed farther north, the sea began to change its voice, losing the familiar rhythm of rolling waves and taking on a new sound altogether. A slow, fractured whisper that came not from water but from ice, from the endless collision of frozen slabs drifting against one another. A sound that seemed to echo from beneath the world itself, old and patient and impossibly calm. The horizon, once a clear line dividing sea and sky, dissolved into a seamless grey vastness, where distance meant nothing and direction became an act of faith. The light never grew strong, not even at noon. It lingered in perpetual twilight, soft and metallic, the kind of light that makes the ocean look like brushed steel, and the men aboard like moving shadows cut from smoke. They sailed through fields of broken ice that clinked and murmured against the hull like 1,000 tiny bells, and sometimes a larger sheet would drift near, its edge rising higher than a man's head, pale blue within, glowing faintly as if lit from its own heart. The pirates moved slowly through it, careful not to strike, for even a small wound in the hull could mean death this far from warmth. And so every man stood silent, listening to the eerie stillness of the frozen sea, each crack or groan amplified into thunder. At night the cold grew so deep it felt alive. It crept beneath clothes, into mouths, into bones, into thought. Breath turned instantly to crystals that hung in the air before falling like invisible dust. Even speech froze quickly, the sound of words breaking apart before reaching the next man's ear. Sleep was no longer rest but retreat. Men huddled together not out of friendship but necessity, seeking the small collective heat that their bodies could still produce. Yet there was beauty in it, terrible and vast, the kind of beauty that silences every human impulse but awe. The stars, when they appeared, burned low and sharp, their light scattering across the ice until it looked as if the sea had been dusted with fire. The moon hung close and immense, its reflection broken into 1,000 silver fragments by the shifting flows, so that the ship seemed to sail across shattered glass. The crew watched in silence, their faces lit by the pale shimmer, and for a few moments each night, even the most hardened among them forgot to be afraid. Food grew scarcer as the cold thickened, the salted meat turning brittle, the bread frozen solid enough to shatter when struck. Water had to be hacked from the edges of the ship and melted over the brazier, and even that tasted of iron and smoke. Still, they endured, because endurance was the only skill left that mattered. They learned to move more slowly, to breathe through cloth, to wrap rope around their hands so the skin would not tear when pulling frozen lines. The body adapted to pain until pain no longer felt like suffering, but simply part of the world, like wind or tide or cold itself. Sometimes, when the wind fell completely still, the world would become so quiet that even the heartbeat of the ship seemed too loud. The ocean turned to a vast plain of glass, the air motionless, the horizon endless. In those moments, time seemed to stop, and the men felt as though they were no longer sailing through the world but through a dream of it, a frozen dream that stretched forever, indifferent and eternal. On one such morning, when the sun barely lifted itself above the horizon and the sky shone pale as bone, they saw the ice close in around them. It moved so slowly it seemed not to move at all, but hour by hour the path ahead narrowed, the floes grinding softly, merging until the ship was surrounded by an unbroken sheet of frozen sea. The captain ordered silence, for even a shout might cause the ice to shift, and the men obeyed, each listening to the quiet pressure that grew around them, the sound of the sea turning solid beneath their feet. They waited, because waiting was all they could do, their breath forming clouds that hung between them like fog, and for the first time they felt the world not as a place to conquer, but as something ancient and immense that tolerated them only by choice. The frozen horizon stretched outward forever, and the ship, small and trembling, was just another shadow crossing its surface, alive only because the ice had not yet decided to take it. And in that silence, deep, cold and endless, They understood the truth every sailor eventually learns, that the ocean does not rage because it hates, nor calm because it forgives, but simply exists, vast and eternal, carrying men like dreams across its shifting skin, reminding them with every wave, every storm, every breath of wind, that they are guests in a kingdom made entirely of motion and silence. When the thaw finally came, it did not arrive with drama or light or any sudden mercy. It came quietly, almost shyly, with a faint change in sound that only those who had listened to the sea for too long could recognize. It began as a tremor beneath the planks, a deep muted groan from somewhere below, as if the world itself was stretching after too long a sleep. The ice that had held them captive began to shift, first by inches, then by slow, reluctant cracks that echoed like distant thunder, and each sound carried with it both hope and danger, for when the sea awakens it remembers nothing of those who slept upon it. The men stirred before dawn, half awake, unsure if what they felt was real or imagined, until one of them whispered, "She's moving." The words were enough. Every man opened his eyes then, not in panic but in reverence, as the ship gave a long, deliberate sigh, the timbers flexing, the hull shuddering against the soft resistance of melting ice. The sound of wood meeting water replaced the old silence, and with it came life, a rhythm of motion, hesitant but undeniable, like the first breath after drowning. They gathered on deck, their faces hollow with sleeplessness and cold, eyes squinting against the pale grey light that had returned without warmth, but with purpose. The sea was no longer still. It was breaking apart in great slow sheets that drifted away from one another, each groaning as it surrendered. Between them, black water appeared, not inviting, not gentle, but alive. The ship rose slightly, freed from the pressure that had held it, and for a moment the men simply stood there, swaying with it, feeling something like gratitude. The air smelled different now, still sharp, still cold, but carrying the faintest trace of salt and movement. That scent of water unbound, it filled their lungs like medicine, harsh but cleansing. Some laughed quietly, not out of joy but disbelief. Others crossed themselves or muttered prayers in languages that no one else understood. The captain said nothing, only watched the ice drift apart, with the stillness of a man who had seen too much to mistake survival for victory. They began to move then, cautiously, the crew working in silence, as if afraid the ice might change its mind. Lines were checked, sails adjusted, the rudder coaxed free of frozen joints. The sound of rope against wood, of creaking masts, of shifting cargo returned like forgotten music. Every motion, even the smallest, felt sacred, a reconnection to life after weeks of suspended time. When the first piece of ice broke fully away from the hull, it did so with a long sighing crack, and a low wave rolled beneath them, lifting the ship in a motion so familiar and yet so strange that some of the men nearly lost balance. It was like being taught again how to move in a world that remembered motion. The ship rocked gently, then steadied, and that simple rocking carried more comfort than any fire could have given. By noon the sky had begun to open, the clouds thinning into thin pale veils that let through a light the colour of pewter. The horizon appeared again, fragile, distant, but visible. They had not seen it in weeks, and its return felt like the reappearance of a forgotten god. The sea was still dotted with ice, each fragment shining faintly, catching light and throwing it back like shards of broken glass. The world looked wounded but beautiful, scarred but alive. Some men wept without sound, the tears freezing before they fell. Others simply stared, hollow-eyed but awake. Their faces were pale, lips cracked, fingers bandaged, yet something in them had softened, the kind of stillness that follows long suffering. Not peace exactly, but the quiet after pain, the thin line between exhaustion and relief. That night, when they lay again in their hammocks, the cold still pressed at them, but it was different now, familiar, almost manageable. The air below deck no longer smelled of death. It smelled of tar, of rope, of wood, of the things that made a ship a living thing. And though the sea still groaned and whispered outside, The men slept deeper than they had in months. The sound of the hull moving through melting ice became a lullaby, slow, rhythmic, like a giant heart beating beneath them. And as the ship pushed forward through the thaw, each man dreamed the same kind of dream, not of gold or land or home, but of motion, the pure and ancient gift of being carried once again across water that moves, of feeling the world alive beneath you, reminding you that even the longest winter, no matter how merciless, eventually lets go. When the first true sunlight returned, it did not burst across the sea like a victory. It crept, slow and uncertain, brushing the horizon with a color that no one had seen in weeks. Something between gold and pale amber, trembling like breath over glass. The men did not cheer. They only stared, stunned and silent, as if afraid that any sound might frighten it away. The light touched the water cautiously, slid along the broken ice, and then began to spread, weaving through the mist until it reached the ship's hull and climbed upward, painting the masts, the ropes, the torn sails, and finally their faces, which looked older, thinner, but unmistakably human again. It was warmth that came second, faint at first but undeniable, a softness that settled on the skin like memory. The deck, which had been an enemy for months, began to thaw beneath their boots, releasing the trapped scent of salt, tar, and old wood. Steam rose in small curling ghosts from the planks, and for the first time in an age, they could see their breath fade instead of hang frozen in the air. No one spoke. They stood scattered across the deck, eyes half closed, letting the sun do its quiet work. It wasn't joy they felt, nor triumph. It was something humbler, deeper, like forgiveness. The ocean itself seemed transformed, the grey glass of winter breaking into living colour again, deep blue streaked with green, touched by light that moved like oil over its surface. Even the sound changed. The water no longer cracked or groaned, it lapped, it sang softly as though relearning its own rhythm. Gulls appeared first as distant dots, then as voices, crying sharp and clear through the thin air. To hear birds again felt like hearing music after silence, proof that the world beyond cold still existed. The men worked without orders that day. They scrubbed decks, mended sails, and dried their soaked clothing on ropes that steamed under the sun. Someone began to hum a tune, something low and rhythmic from the coast of Brittany or maybe the Irish Sea, and one by one others joined in until the ship filled with sound, rough, uneven, but warm, full of life. The tune drifted out over the water, mingled with the cries of the birds, and the sea carried it away. By noon, the light had grown strong enough to show colour in their cheeks again. The captain, standing near the wheel, took off his hat and held it against his chest, not as prayer but as habit, a small acknowledgement of something greater than himself. Around him the crew laughed quietly, not loud laughter, not wild, but the soft kind that comes when the body remembers it has survived. That night, when the sun finally slipped beneath the horizon, the world did not turn black the way it had in winter. The sky burned faintly with colour. A long, thin band of rose and copper stretched above the sea, fading so slowly that it felt like the day refused to die completely. The men watched it until the last ember disappeared, reluctant to go below deck, unwilling to lose sight of that warmth even in sleep. When they finally did lie down, the cold still lingered in corners, but it no longer carried the same cruelty. The air felt lighter, touched by promise. The hammock swayed gently, ropes creaked in familiar rhythm, and the faint smell of salt and sunlight clung to their skin. One man whispered, half to himself, "It's coming back," and though no one answered, they all knew what he meant. Sleep that night came differently, not as a retreat from the cold, but as rest earned after enduring it. Dreams were no longer of frozen seas or endless grey. They were of warmth returning, of waves that glimmered under sunlit skies, of home perhaps, or at least of land that did not move. The sea rocked them softly, and for once the sound of water against the hull felt like a promise rather than a warning. And somewhere deep in that sound, quiet and unending, was the truth of all their endurance, that even after the darkest season, the body remembers light, the world remembers warmth, and the sea, though merciless, always gives back what it takes, if only you endure long enough to see it. When they finally sighted land, it was not with shouting or the sudden rush of triumph that ballads like to imagine. It was quieter than that, slower, a recognition more than a revelation. The coastline appeared first as a smudge of darker grey against the horizon, then as a line, then as shape, then as the unmistakable colour of earth, dull brown and green under a pale sky that still carried the chill of the season, but now pulsed faintly with life. For men who had spent months seeing nothing but ice and water, even that meagre stretch of shore looked impossibly rich, as if the whole world had turned fertile while they weren't looking. The ship approached cautiously, sails half raised, the sound of creaking wood softer now, more confident, like an old animal remembering how to walk. The air changed first. The salt smell of the sea began to blend with something else, smoke, soil, and the faint sweet odour of things that grow. It was the smell of life, and it hit the men like memory, stirring something in their chests they hadn't realised had gone quiet. When the anchor dropped, it made a sound that felt final, heavy and certain, echoing through the hull like the closing of a long, cold chapter. The crew moved slowly, careful in their joy, as if afraid that too much haste might wake the sea's cruelty again. They coiled ropes, checked rigging, cleaned decks, not because it was ordered, but because order itself felt sacred now, a way of saying thank you to the ship that had carried them through the dark. Then came the moment that no man ever forgets. The first step on land. The ground felt wrong at first, solid yet uneven, unmoving but unreliable in its stillness. Legs that had learned to sway with every motion of the waves struggled to find rhythm on something that refused to move. Some of the men laughed at themselves, stumbling like drunkards, gripping posts and fences, while others simply stood still, looking at their boots in the dirt as though trying to remember how earth felt beneath them. The port was small, little more than a cluster of stone buildings and wooden piers, their roofs dark with soot, their windows clouded by salt and smoke. But it was alive. Dogs barked from alleyways, gulls screamed overhead, and somewhere beyond the docks came the unmistakable murmur of voices. Real, human, alive. After months of nothing but wind and sea, that sound felt almost divine. Taverns opened their doors to the returning crew, the smell of fire and ale spilling out into the cold air. The warmth hit them immediately. Not just the heat of the hearths, but the human warmth of sound and company, the thud of mugs, the crackle of laughter, the rhythm of stories spilling into each other like waves. They sat close to fires that burned bright and reckless, their faces lit with orange light, steam rising from damp coats and boots. For a while they said nothing at all. They only listened, to the fire, to the laughter, to the sound of chairs scraping wood. It was enough. Outside, the world was still thawing, patches of frost clinging stubbornly to the edges of the cobblestones, but even the cold felt gentler now, the kind that wakes rather than punishes. The sun hung low and pale over the harbour, its light catching on the wet masts and ropes, until the whole port shimmered like a dream half remembered. The ship rested quietly at anchor, her hull dark against the gleaming water, her sails furled, her deck empty for the first time in months. That night, as the men lay in real beds, straw-filled, uneven, but soft beyond imagining, they found themselves listening for the familiar creak of wood, the slap of waves, the sound of the sea breathing. It was not there, and that absence felt strange, like silence where a heartbeat should be. Yet in that silence lay peace, heavy and deep and almost frightening in its stillness. Sleep came easily, and when it did, it brought warmth instead of cold. The dreams were not of storms or ice or endless grey horizons, but of colour, green fields, brown soil, sunlight spilling through clouds. And though each man would return to the sea in his own time, that night belonged to land, to stillness, to the impossible sweetness of having survived. Outside, the tide shifted, slow and steady, rocking the empty ship, as though in gratitude, her hull whispering softly against the dock, as if even she were dreaming, of ice melting, of sunlight on her deck, of the long voyage behind her and the promise of warmer seas ahead. When the last of the crew had gone ashore and the harbour swallowed their laughter, the ship was left alone, moored quietly against the wooden pier, rocking with a gentleness that seemed almost shy after so many months of violence and cold. The ropes creaked softly in their sockets, tightening and loosening with the slow pulse of the tide, and the sound echoed through her empty hull like the breath of something that still lived but slept. The sea pressed lightly against her sides, whispering as though in conversation, and somewhere deep within the wood, where ice had once cracked and groaned, the silence settled like snow, not heavy, not oppressive, but patient, covering everything with calm. Inside, the hammocks still swayed slightly, their ropes murmuring in the faint draught that moved through the lower deck. The smell of tar and smoke and human breath lingered, mingling with the sharper scent of salt and the sweetness of thawing rope. In the corners, droplets formed and fell with the steady rhythm of time returning to normal speed. A single lantern hung near the mast, its flame weak and uneven, but it cast just enough light to show the traces of life left behind. A tin cup half filled with stale water, a boot lying on its side, a patch of wool torn and forgotten. The ship held these things gently, as though reluctant to disturb them, as though aware that what remained of her crew existed now only in memory. From the deck, the world looked softer. The horizon no longer cut sharp against the sky. It blurred, wrapped in the grey gold of late afternoon. The wind that once roared and tore now moved like breath against the sails, shifting them just enough to remind the ship that it still could. Seagulls perched along the railing, watching the water with their heads tilted, unbothered by the quiet. Their cries were sharp but distant, too light to disturb the peace that filled the air. Far off, the harbour bell rang once, and its tone drifted across the water like a memory of command. The ship did not answer. She did not need to. For the first time in months she had no orders to follow, no course to hold, no men to keep alive. She could simply float, suspended between sea and sky, between what had been and what would come next. From the shore she looked peaceful, a dark silhouette against the last line of fading colour, but inside she was alive with memory. Every beam carried the echo of footsteps, every rope remembered the pull of frozen hands, every plank still held the faint warmth of bodies pressed together in the dark. Ships remember in ways people forget. They hold the vibrations of the past in their bones. When the moon rose cold and perfect, it spread silver light across her deck, and for a moment it looked as though frost had returned. But this time it was gentle, not cruel, a quiet shimmer rather than a threat. The sea beneath her was calm, the night wind light and forgiving. The ship rested, and the silence around her deepened into something sacred, something almost holy. And if anyone had been there to listen closely, they might have sworn they heard her sigh, not with sorrow, but with relief, as though the old wooden heart within her had finally learned that even the hardest winters end, and even the loneliest vessels, once released from ice and duty, are allowed to dream. During the first quiet night without men aboard, the ship did not sleep in darkness. She dreamed, not with light or motion, but with memory. In her timbers lingered the voices of the crew, faint as the hum of ropes in wind, the laughter of men that once filled her narrow corridors, the murmur of stories told half asleep beneath flickering lanterns. Each sound rose and fell with the tide, carried through the hull like echoes in the lungs of something alive. The sea, that endless patient witness, pressed softly against her sides, and the rhythm of the waves became the slow heartbeat of remembrance. Where hammocks had swung, the air still moved, as if invisible bodies shifted in sleep. The ropes creaked with the same tired music they had made every night of the long winter, and the wooden beams exhaled warmth they no longer possessed, releasing it in faint sighs that could almost be mistaken for breathing. Even the smell, tar, wool, smoke, salt, and human sweat, persisted like a ghost that refused to leave, a scent that bound the vessel to its former life. In that smell lived the truth of survival, a proof more intimate than any story ever told, the scent of men who had refused to die. The lantern by the mast burned low, its flame bending in the small breath of air that slipped through a cracked plank. The flicker of light turned the empty deck into a theatre of absence, shadows shifting where figures once stood, outlines of movement without substance. If one watched long enough, one could imagine a man leaning over the rail, or hear the faint scrape of boots on wood, or picture the captain's coat stirring in the wind, as he gave silent orders no one needed to obey anymore. The ship held these shapes tenderly, unwilling to let them go. Outside, the harbour slept beneath a blanket of pale mist, and the moon traced slow silver paths across the rigging. The gulls had gone quiet, the tide whispered against the pier, and the only sound beyond the ship's own murmuring was the occasional ripple of water beneath her keel. The world felt smaller, as if folded around her, sealing her in a cocoon of stillness. Within that stillness, the echoes grew clearer. The rhythm of work, the crack of frozen rope, the cough of a man half asleep, the soft human noises that had filled every hour of her existence. Ships, like people, remember through rhythm. They do not keep images. They keep vibrations. The timbers that once shook with storms now vibrated with the ghost of those storms. The planks that had felt the stomp of boots now trembled faintly as though expecting them to return. Every motion of the tide triggered an echo of motion past, and for a moment the boundaries between memory and presence blurred. Toward dawn the mist thickened, and for a heartbeat the silence inside the ship was broken by a sound that was not wind nor sea nor wood. A faint, human sigh. It might have been air moving through an open seam, or perhaps the final echo of a dream too stubborn to fade. Whatever it was, it seemed to pass through the ship like a benediction, leaving behind a deeper calm. The light returned slowly, grey before gold, filling the deck with the cool clarity of morning. The echoes faded back into the wood where they would remain, not haunting but dwelling, patient and eternal. The ship floated gently, her reflection trembling on the water's surface, the ghost of the crew safe within her bones. And when the sun finally rose, warming her planks, it seemed for a moment that she breathed again, not because men had returned, but because memory itself was alive, and the echoes of those who endured would never entirely leave the sea. It was weeks after the crew had gone, when the harbour had grown warm again and the ice that clung to the posts had long since melted into the sea, that a single man returned to the ship. He came at dawn, moving quietly, the hem of his coat brushing against the stone pier still wet with morning mist, his boots making no sound against the planks as he stepped aboard. The world was still half asleep, the air heavy with salt and dew, and even the gulls had not yet found their voices. The ship, though empty, seemed to know him. The wood creaked softly under his weight, not in protest but in recognition, as though her timbers remembered the shape of his stride and were glad to feel it again. He paused near the railing, resting one hand on the cold wood, and for a long time he did not move. His breath came slow and visible in the cool air, his eyes tracing the familiar lines of the deck, the rigging, the mast, all unchanged, yet touched by something softer now, a peace that had come only in absence. The brazier was gone, the hammocks empty, the smell of smoke long faded, but the air still carried a faint ghost of life, a warmth that memory had left behind. He could almost hear them, the low murmur of laughter in the dark, the shuffle of boots, the quiet curse of a man tying knots with cold hands. He closed his eyes, and for a moment the sounds were real again, as though the ship itself whispered them back. The morning light shifted as the sun rose higher, painting the deck in a thin wash of gold that glimmered through the ropes. Dust floated lazily through the air, catching in the beams, each particle moving like a memory, slow, graceful, unwilling to fall. The sailor reached down and touched the planks, his fingers tracing the grooves worn deep by years of feet, the scars of storms, the marks where barrels and boots and blood had once rested. The wood was warm from the first light of day, but beneath it he felt the echo of cold, the weight of everything the ship had carried, everything it had survived. He walked to the mast and laid his hand upon it, leaning in close as if to listen. The wind sighed through the ropes, the sea lapped against the hull, and from somewhere deep within came the soft, hollow sound of the ship's heart, the slow, rhythmic creak of wood settling, breathing. He whispered something then, though no one was there to hear it. A name, perhaps, or a prayer, or maybe just a thank you. Whatever it was, the ship seemed to answer, not with words but with silence that felt alive, an understanding that needed no language. The sailor stayed for hours, sitting on the deck with his back against the railing, watching the harbour awaken. Children's voices rose faintly from the distant streets. Bells rang, sails from other ships flapped like wings in the morning breeze. The world had moved on. But here, aboard this vessel of memory and endurance, time felt different, slower, wider, deeper. It existed not in minutes, but in tides. As the sun climbed higher, the light turned warmer, and the air filled with the scent of salt and tar and faraway heat. The man stood, stretching his stiff legs, and for a while he simply watched the sea. That same sea that had once frozen around them, that had howled and broken and forgiven. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes not from joy but from acceptance. He touched the wood one last time, gentle, as one might touch the shoulder of an old friend, then turned and walked back toward the pier. Behind him, the ship rocked slightly with the tide, her rigging whispering in the wind, and though she made no sound beyond the ordinary creaks of wood and rope, it seemed for a moment that she exhaled, a long, slow breath, as if acknowledging his farewell. By the time he reached the shore, the harbour was alive again. Voices rising, nets thrown, gulls circling. He did not look back, but if he had, he might have seen the light catch on the ship's hull, a brief shimmer like a heartbeat, then fade into the rhythm of the waves. And so she remained, quiet, enduring, her decks empty but her memory full, floating gently against the dock as the day unfolded, holding within her the echoes of every voice that had ever called her home. Years passed and the harbour changed as all harbours do. The water grew shallower, the streets busier, and the ship, once proud, once alive, became part of the landscape, a fixture at the pier that no one really looked at anymore. Children played near her hull, their voices bouncing off the wood that had once echoed with commands, and fishermen tied their nets to her sides, trusting her weight as though she were stone. Seasons washed over her without ceremony, rain and sun and snow and salt, each leaving its trace upon the wood, each softening her edges until she looked less like a ship and more like a memory of one. The ropes frayed, the sails rotted, and yet she remained, floating, quiet, patient, as if waiting for something she already knew would come. The men who had once sailed her were gone now, scattered across years and continents, some buried in soil, some lost to other seas, some remembered only in names carved into tavern walls, but their voices had never left her completely. On certain nights when the wind came from the north and the tide was low, those who lived near the docks swore they could hear a faint humming from the old ship, a low, rhythmic sound like breath through hollow wood, rising and falling in time with the waves. No one feared it. Some even said it was comforting, like the sea was singing to itself. Then one winter, without warning, the storm returned. It came out of the east, hard and sudden, the sky folding into itself, the clouds the colour of iron, the wind thick with rain and salt. The waves rose high against the piers, battering the old ship where she lay moored, the ropes snapping one by one until the last gave way, and she began to drift, not fast, not violently, but with a strange, deliberate grace, as though the sea had reached out and taken her hand. Those who watched from the shore later said it looked almost peaceful, the way she moved. No struggle, no fight, just the slow yielding of something returning to where it belonged. The storm swallowed her soon after, the rain closing over her like a curtain, and when morning came, the harbour was calm again. No wreck washed up, no debris floated back. The ship was gone. For a while people spoke of her, as people do, with wonder, with nostalgia, with the vague guilt of having ignored something alive until it was no longer there. But in time, even that faded. Only the sea remembered. And sometimes on nights when the wind lies still and the moon turns the water to silver, a shadow moves beneath the surface. The faint outline of a hull, the glimmer of old wood drifting just below the waves. The water ripples softly around it, never violent, never cruel, only gentle, as if tracing the shape of an old friend. The sea does not mourn, but it remembers. It remembers the weight of wood, the warmth of hands, the rhythm of feet on deck, the whisper of rope through cold fingers. It remembers the laughter of men in storms, the silence of fear, the songs hummed in darkness to keep the world away. It remembers everything that ever touched it, because memory is what gives it shape. And if you stand by that harbour long enough, listening past the wind and the gulls and the tide, you might still hear it, that low, patient sound beneath the surface, the slow heartbeat of something that has gone home, not lost. Beneath the surface, where the light bends and softens and sound becomes touch, the sea keeps its own kind of language, not made of words but of memory, of currents and rhythm, and the slow, endless conversation between time and depth. Down there, where everything drifts and nothing truly stops, the remains of the old ship rest quietly, her wood darkened, her ribs softened by salt and silence, yet still intact in the way that matters, still holding the faint impression of what she once was. The sea does not destroy what it takes. It transforms it, folding it into itself like a story retold in the language of water. Fish move through her corridors where men once slept, silver shapes gliding through beams that were once walls, their motion effortless, their presence neither reverent nor careless but natural, as though they know they are swimming through memory. The lantern hooks still hang, empty and rusted, and sometimes when the light filters down from above, it catches on them and turns the water gold, a flicker of warmth in a world made of cold blue. The ship lies tilted, half buried in sand and silt, and the sea hums softly around her, not a song you can hear, but one you can feel in the bones, a vibration that runs through everything alive. It is not sorrow the sea sings of, nor loss. It sings of return, of the slow, inevitable merging of what was separate back into what is whole. It sings of storms endured, of wood that held, of breath that became current and sound that became tide. It carries the laughter of the crew in its waves, the heartbeat of their nights in its motion, their courage dissolved into its endless depth. In every swell and every whisper the ocean remembers the hands that touched it, the bodies that gave themselves to it, the stories that ended upon its surface but continued below. And if you listen from the shore on a still night, when the moon is low and the world is quiet enough to mistake silence for music, you can almost hear it, the soft unbroken murmur rising from the deep, a song without beginning or end, carrying within it every breath that was ever taken at sea. It is the sound of wood turning to salt, of rope turning to light, of men turning to memory. It is the sea breathing through what it has kept. The waves roll in and retreat, forever patient, forever remembering. They touch the rocks, the sand, the shore, and with every touch they leave behind a fragment of that old story, a rhythm that never ends, a lullaby whispered through centuries, meant not for the living but for those who have learned that all things, sooner or later, return. And so the sea continues to sing, beneath moon and storm and sunlight, its song stretching through the bones of the world, slow, deep, unending, the song beneath the waves.